The God Delusion by Richard Dawkins, book review. So this is part of my scripted book review series in which I go back and reread old book reviews that I wrote on the blog years ago. In this case, I wrote this in 2007. I mention this explicitly because I want to help put this in context. I think it's important for a couple of reasons. Number one is Richard Dawkins' reputation was much better in 2007 than it is now. At least in certain circles. I think since then, he's gotten himself in trouble with some feminists. He's gotten a reputation for kind of being argumentative on Twitter, and that's kind of lowered his prestige a little bit. And then kind of accusations of Islamophobia or kind of xenophobia or racism have been attached to him. I don't want to get into all that or whether these accusations are fair or unfair. I guess I mentioned that mainly just to say that at the time I read this book, the public perception of him was maybe more positive, and perhaps that influenced my own perception of the book. I guess the other thing to talk about is kind of where I was at myself in terms of my own beliefs about God or the universe or whatever back in 2007. Because I think they are a little bit different than they are now. Going way back, I grew up in a conservative Christian environment. Not only did we go to church twice a week, Sunday and also Wednesdays, Wednesday night church youth group, but I went to a private Christian school where we would, Bible was one of the subjects that we studied every day at school. So I grew up kind of very familiar not only with the Bible, but also kind of with Christian worldview. I have some kind of background in Christian apologetics and how they kind of defend the faith and the various arguments that they make kind of for God. I don't want to really get into my whole kind of spiritual history because that's a whole separate subject for a different time. So I'll just try and be kind of brief on this. I began to notice a number of the problems with kind of the Christian faith and did a few kind of shifts of position over the years. First moving from kind of a very conservative Christian standpoint to a much more liberal Christian standpoint. To moving to more of like a pluralist standpoint, a pluralist being someone who believes that kind of all religions are equally valid, or maybe kind of a deist standpoint. Or I guess you could say maybe a confused standpoint would be the way to put it. Wasn't quite an atheist at that point yet. I wouldn't even call myself an agnostic. I was some sort of religious, and I was very scared of losing the security of a belief in God or a belief in an afterlife or a belief that kind of life had some purpose. And I was maybe beginning to start to feel like I was losing that. And that scared me. At the same time, around about this time is when Christopher Dawkins started to become popular. And I had a lot of spare time. I was between jobs. That's a whole nother story. So I would spend a lot of time in the apartment kind of watching videos online. And there was this website called TV Links, which is now defunct. But they used to have like links to just about everything. And just kind of to put something intellectually engaging on in the background. I used to put on a lot of these debates between kind of Richard Dawkins and Christian people, or sometimes I go point counterpoint. Like I'd watch a video defending Christianity, and then I'd watch a video by Christopher Dawkins. So my introduction to Christopher Dawkins was primarily through watching him on video. I guess nowadays it would be mostly YouTube. I think back in those days there was YouTube and a host of other competitors. This was before YouTube was completely dominant. But anyways, I watched a lot of him on video. And I found him an absolutely captivating speaker. And he was saying like a lot of things that made perfect sense to me, but I never really kind of had the courage to think myself or was never quite willing to kind of make those leaps of logic, although maybe they were in the back of my mind. And he just kind of helped to make them so explicitly clear. Things like he would say, you know, like, we're all kind of atheists. Like, you don't believe in Thor, you don't believe in Zeus, you know, you don't believe in Vishnu. You're atheist with respect to all these other gods. I've just kind of gone one step further and, you know, you believe in one God, but you disbelieve in all the others. I've just kind of gone that one step further and don't believe in that one God either. And that made a lot of sense to me. The other thing I really remember making a lot of sense is, you know, like growing up in the church, you're made to kind of feel guilty for allowing kind of your faith. Well, how do I want to put this? You're made to feel that if you lose your faith, that's kind of some fault in you. Like, you didn't have enough faith, you weren't spiritual enough, or you were arrogant and you trusted to your own intellect instead of trusting God. You know, I've heard variations on that so many times growing up about, you know, you have to be careful. These intellectuals are so arrogant, they trust in their own judgment. You know, just kind of this feeling that having faith was virtuous, and that if you started to kind of lose this, it was some sort of problem with you. What Richard Dawkins said over and over again in these videos, which made so much sense to me, is he said, why do we make a virtue of believing something without evidence? Why is that virtuous? He's like, that should be something that's to be despised. Not something to be made a virtue of. We should make a virtue of people who follow where the evidence goes and believe in that. I'm really not doing any of this justice, am I? Apologies, this is kind of my poor paraphrase of him. But he's quite a talented speaker in his own right. So you should really just kind of watch his videos, I guess, to get the full effect of it. I guess the point being, I was very interested in him because of these videos. And this was round about the time he had this book out. So in all these videos, he kept saying, I explain this in more detail in my book. Or, you know, the full argument is in my book. Or, you know, buy my book to kind of fully understand this. Which, in retrospect, this is the most obvious book shill in the world. This is what all the authors say to get you to buy their book. But at the risk of admitting my own naivete, I kind of bought into this. I thought, okay, I know a little bit of what he's saying from these videos, but if I want the full argument, it's in the book. And I'm going to jump ahead of myself a little bit here and say that the book was interesting. There was a lot of stuff in the book, but you know, if you don't really need to buy the book, you definitely get the flavor of what he's saying from watching him on those YouTube videos. If you're content to just leave it at that, you can leave it at that. But I was in the bookstore and I saw his book. I was actually a little bit nervous before buying his book because, as I said before, I was nervous about kind of losing that security about an afterlife or a benevolent deity or kind of a purpose. And I felt it was slipping away from me a little bit, but I hadn't lost my faith completely at that point. And I was nervous that if I would read this book, I would just lose my faith completely, which isn't what happened. The book makes a number of points, but I don't think Richard Dawkins makes his argument quite as strong as he thinks he is. And I'm going to get into all my critiques of the book in just a minute. But it's worth me saying, actually, that one of the reasons I was so harsh on the book, a little bit harsh on the book, had mixed feelings on the book, is because Richard Dawkins' best arguments I had already absorbed by hours of kind of watching him on video. So maybe that kind of left some of his less impressive arguments for the book. But yeah, I'll get into that. as I'm reading this book, it's a really long book, and to kind of give it it's not a really long book, but there's a lot of stuff in the book. And to really go into it and do it point by point would be this huge review. I mean, to do it point by point would produce a review, which is longer than the book. So obviously that's impossible for those reasons. So I can't go through this point by point. I'm not going to attempt to. I'm just going to try and kind of categorize maybe how some of the arguments struck me. Some of the time I was reading it and I thought, oh, that is a really good point. Some of the time I was reading it, I thought, okay, that's an interesting point, but having been through Christian schools my whole life, I already know that there's a religious counter-argument to this. Richard Dawkins is not being quite as inventive as he thinks he's being. Like, he thinks he's kind of coming up with these things religious people haven't even thought of, but they thought of it, and they've already got counter-arguments to it. And then I thought, that's actually a pretty terrible argument. There are some terrible arguments mixed in here. And then there are some things that really gave me a headache, where I was like, does that work? It kind of works. No, it doesn't. I go back and forth on it, and it gave me a headache about it. So I'll start with the strongest points first. Given Richard Dawkins' background as a scientist, the strongest parts are the scientific parts, where he kind of lays out a very kind of strong scientific argument for there being absolutely no evidence for the existence of God. The philosophical parts of the book are interesting, but they're slightly disappointing in the sense that at times Dawkins doesn't fully seem to understand the theological ideas that he's arguing against. Or he kind of fails to anticipate that there's a theological response to this already. And in this respect, it would really have benefited him if he would have looked at kind of what the Christian counter-arguments to his, or the religious counter-arguments to the arguments he's already making are. Now, apparently I'm not the only one who noticed this, because Richard Dawkins addresses all these criticisms in the preface. I bought the paperback edition. So the paperback edition came out after the hardcover edition had already done the rounds. Richard Dawkins had already received a lot of these criticisms, and he had a new preface to it. So he brings up the point that people had these criticisms, but then he just dismisses it. Somebody apparently wrote a defense of him called the Courtier's Reply, and he quotes a long section of it. And the Courtier's Reply is kind of like an ironic thing. In the Courtier's Reply, it's imagining a world in which somebody has called, it's the fairy tale, The Emperor Has No Clothes. And it's a response to somebody who says the emperor has no clothes. Kind of a ironic thing. It says, really he should have studied all the work that theologians have done in Venice on invisible fabrics, or kind of the fine invisible tapestry that they have in Paris, before he had the authority to say the emperor had no clothes. Kind of making that argument that it's ridiculous to say you should have a theological background before you can say there is no God. And then Richard Dawkins goes on and he says, to expand the point, most of us happily disavow fairies, astrology, and the flying spaghetti monster without first immersing ourselves in Pastafarian theology, etc. Sorry, I'm going to move to the bathroom as I talk. Now, I think all of this is fine as long as Richard Dawkins is in the realm of the scientific evidence for and against God, or against God, as his case may be. To say, looking at the natural world, we have no evidence for God, and I don't even need to get into the theology or the philosophy of it. But that's not what he does. He gets into the philosophical questions. He gets into the theology of it. And if he's going to do that, then he should know what the Christian philosophers have been saying about this. So it's just kind of, he didn't do his homework, and then it's just kind of doubling down on his arrogance to say, oh, I don't need to research the Christian counter-arguments to my argument, when he had that new preface. If he's going to get into philosophy, he needs to know what the religious argument against it is. Now, part of the problem is that religion is just too big of a subject. You could spend so much time arguing about how ridiculous Christianity is. But then, what about Judaism or Islam or Hinduism or something like that? It's just so hard to argue against all religions at once. It's too much of a moving target to nail down effectively. Richard Dawkins decides then to go after the softest target for most of the book. The people he wants to go after are the theists, the people who not only believe that God exists, but that they can know exactly what God wants, and they can force their own narrow view of God onto everyone else. A lot of these people even invent a hell for disbelievers. Most of the book is focused on these people. Now, I'm in complete agreement with Richard Dawkins on this. I think it's it's one thing to say, does God exist? And that's an interesting philosophical question, and a difficult one. But to have, say, okay, God exists, and this is his book, and these are all his rules, and these are his prophets, that's just, I'm going to show my bias here. That's just stupid. How do you know? How does anybody know? So to have kind of I shouldn't say it's stupid. Sorry, that was a little bit harsh of me. But it strikes me that that's an easy position to say, to attack, because you say, okay, what's the evidence that this is, that the Bible is God's holy book and not the Quran? I think it's very easy to attack that philosophical position. And Richard Dawkins does, and he goes after it. But what's a more difficult position to prove is that there's no God at all. It's one thing to say that, the Christians don't have evidence for what they're claiming, but it's another thing to say that there is no God. And I think Richard Dawkins spends part of the book arguing this position, but he really should have spent more time on this part, because if you prove Christianity is not true, that doesn't prove there's no God. But if you can prove there's no God, then that would prove Christianity is not true. So he's kind of wasting his time going after all these easy targets, when the big target, there's no God, is there a God? However you would define God, that's the big question. Now, he does spend some time on this. The core of his argument against God is actually the same one Bertrand Russell used years ago. Bertrand Russell had an essay, Why I'm Not a Christian. I actually had to read it in my Christian schools as part of the Christian apologetics, because our teacher argued a response against it. But the core argument is that there are many things about the beginning of the universe that we don't understand. Therefore, many people think it was created by God. But Dawkins, like Russell before him, argues that you can't simply solve the problem by referring back to God, because now you have to explain where God comes from. And Dawkins says, since God is a complex, intelligent being, and the universe is just a thing, by hypothesizing that a God created the universe, now you've just increased the problem, because now you've got this complex, intelligent being, and you've got to explain where he came from, and where the complexity came from, and where the intelligence came from. Now, my religious professor, again back when I was in the Christian schools, just kind of laughed this argument off. Like, isn't it ridiculous to ask where God came from? God is God. And I'm almost inclined to do that as well, to say, well, you know, like, God is God. He doesn't come from anywhere. He's outside of space and time. It's not kind of the same rules as where the universe comes from. And then I thought that, and I thought, you know, Dawkins, if he was here, would say, no, you can't just say that God is outside of space and time. That's just declaring something by fiat. Everything has to be explained. And I thought, which one's right? Is Dawkins right? Or I just got a headache thinking about this, thinking about whether we need to explain where God comes from, or whether God is just kind of outside of the normal universe and the normal rules. And then, of course, after kind of going all through this and getting a huge headache, you come back to the question, well, I mean, where did everything come from anyways? I mean, where did the Big Bang come from? I understand how the Big Bang created the universe, but how did everything get into the Big Bang? And if science could answer these questions, like if science could answer where the Big Bang came from, then you'd have another question about how did that get there. So ultimately, you just have, you would never solve this mystery. Things would just keep going back one origin step after another into infinity. So like at a certain point then, wouldn't you almost need to say, okay, there's something outside of the causation chain. At some point, there's something that was not caused by anything else. And then that something would have to be God. I don't know. Can you claim that God doesn't need a cause? This is where my headache comes in. So I do have to admit that Dawkins got me thinking a lot. And you know, as I was reading this book, and I would read it in a coffee shop, with like a huge cup of coffee, just kind of thinking about these issues. It was interesting to think about it, but at the end I was still an agnostic. I don't think Dawkins convincingly made a case for atheism. Maybe that's just me. Now the last third of the book deals with all the social problems caused by religion. Now, not surprisingly, again, Dawkins is going after the soft, juicy targets. He's going after the extremists. But he's also holding the moderates responsible, because the moderates are responsible for fostering a climate in which extremists are allowed to breed. I'm oversimplifying here a little bit, but I don't know. I'm sort of sympathetic to what he's saying, because I at times have thought this too, you know, that kind of the extreme anti-gay position of the church is kind of enabled by kind of the more moderate anti-gay people. You know, the people say, oh, okay, we shouldn't hate gays, but homosexuality is a sin. You know, that moderate position does kind of leave a jumping off position for where people become more extreme. The thing I worry about a little bit with that argument, though, is like everything has a moderate wing and an extreme wing. I mean, every political ideology, every belief system. So I'm a bit sensitive to this myself. When I was still in this conservative Christian environment, I started self-identifying as a socialist. And I meant, you know, in my mind, I'm thinking, you know, like a democratic socialist, you know, I wasn't thinking of like totalitarianism, but like democratic socialism. But people within this community started kind of accusing me of being kind of part of a chain of ideology that led to Stalin and Pol Pot and, you know, the death camps and all that. You know, because in their mind, me being a moderate socialist was enabling the extreme Stalinists. Yeah, you know? So, like, I agree with Dawkins, but I don't agree with him, I guess, is what I want to say. I think he's kind of right in that the moderate maybe are enabling this extremist, but I'm also worried that this argument could be used against every belief system, because every belief system has an extreme wing. Dawkins also makes the case that he would like society to stop regarding blind faith without evidence as a virtue. And he wants to subject people's belief systems to the same kind of scrutiny and debate that every other idea is subject to in society. For example, he doesn't think that Mormons should get off without scrutiny. Yeah, like, you can't just say, I'm a Mormon, and people say, okay, I respect your beliefs. You know, I'm not a Mormon myself, but I respect that you believe this. His attack on Mormonism, by the way, I think kind of comes through more on some of the videos than in the book. But, you know, he thinks Mormonism is just ridiculous. And I agree with him here. I mean, I don't want to get into the whole thing, but if you examine the history of Mormonism and what Mormons actually believe, it is just ridiculous, right? It makes no logical sense. But, so Dawkins would like to, instead of just kind of respecting somebody else's beliefs, to kind of debate the beliefs just like you would any other political ideology. The problem with this, though, is that religious beliefs have more of a community identity than political ideology. So, for example, you know, it's perfectly normal in some families for, like, you know, one person to be a Democrat and one person to be a Republican, and, or, you know, inside of communities, and they can have these debates. But religion tends to define a community. I don't know, maybe we're moving away from that now, but certainly historically it had. And you know, this is where the question of Islamophobia comes up. The fact that you're not really attacking somebody's intellectual beliefs, you're attacking the identity of a community. And you know, Mormonism, you know, as ridiculous as it is, there was a time in American history where Mormons were persecuted because of their belief. And I don't think anyone wants to go back to that period. So maybe it is just kind of better to kind of give Mormons kind of more respect, or just kind of respect the identity of religion and not ridicule or mock it or kind of hold it up to the same kind of public scrutiny that we'd hold other beliefs up to. I don't know. This is another thing I go back and forth on. How do you deal with religion in a multicultural society? Because, you know, we all have to live together. It's obviously not a clear-cut issue. If it was a clear-cut issue, we wouldn't have been having these culture wars for the last 50 years. As with everything else in the book, I'm not sure I entirely agree with Dawkins, but he gives some interesting thoughts. Yeah. What else to say about this book? Things I remember as being quite interesting, and these are kind of just addendums. But he talks in the book about where religion comes from in the first place. Because, you know, if you believe in evolution like Dawkins does, then it's quite an interesting question, where does religion come from? Like, why does almost every society and every culture have a religion, or, you know, had religions in the old days? Because if it's irrational, then what advantage does this irrational thinking have? And how did it kind of get preserved in our genes or kind of passed down from evolution? And Dawkins, to his credit, tackles this question and comes up with a number of very interesting theories, which As with everything else in the book, I'm not sure it entirely convinced me, but it was interesting to think about. That part of the book has kind of stuck with me through the years, to be honest. Yeah. There were other parts of the book I found less impressive. For example, I